What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So as y'all know, today is indeed Wednesday, which means the new summit is now live here at Motorfest, and with that, this is also the last summit until the next month in the main stage is going to happen. Funnily enough, I think it's the final month until the next update, which is still kind of insane. I feel like this entire season has taken forever. But either way, though, this is going to have the Porsche 919 Club Sport, which, if you are wondering, yes, this is going to be a racing vehicle. So if you thought this thing was going to be a hypercar, it is not. In fact, you also get to drive it here on the vehicle loaned event, and to be honest, guys, it's pretty decent. As you can see, this car is also going to look pretty awesome. Gonna say right now, I highly doubt if you do want this car to be the new meta. I don't think that's probably going to happen, but hey, it is going to be a new vehicle to do. Luckily, by the way, guys, I would admit this, every single event in this summit is going to be fairly straightforward. You've definitely seen the events before. Nothing too insane there. For me, I did end up using a chemist set, which is kind of funny because I never use chemist sets at all in these summits. And I was like, oh, so that's what it's like to be a little bit faster. I did not use any pro settings, as I mainly did end up using the 919 Street. And this car is going to be fantastic with no pro settings. So is the Mercedes AMG 1. They're honestly both great without pro settings, man, so you really don't need to worry about that. Besides that, though, when it does come to some of these skills here, guys, the first one is an escape. For this, I did end up using, again, the 919 Street. I pretty much spawned in, turned around, went after the objective, guys, and just followed it. And to be honest, that was basically it. It is going to be fairly simple. For the Speedtrap, this one is going to be on the airfield. I got 299.9 miles per hour solo running a chemist set. If you are going to slipstream, you could probably get a tad faster on this one, which is pretty funny, but I took around 300 miles an hour, basically called it. I'm not going to try to get like another 5,000 points there. For the final escape, this one is again also going to be very easy to do with the 919 Street. Once you guys get on the road, kind of follow that, get to the highway, and you're pretty much good to go. 6,792 yards basically got me almost a maxed out score. That was basically it on that one. When it does come to the events, though, I would say once again a lot of players are probably going to recognize these, but there is one event I did want to mention something on. The one all the way here on the right, guys, in the middle, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce whatever that says, but this is going to be the Liberty Territory event, so expect this one to take at least around, I'd say, probably 10.5 plus minutes to maybe 12 to 13, depending on how you do end up doing. You will have to use 3 different vehicles, and if you are wondering, they're all loaned. The first car is the 919 Street, the second one is going to be the Mercedes AMG 1, and the third one is the Project Evo. So keep that in mind, guys, when you are doing this one. You are going to have to use 3 different vehicle loans on that, and in fact, this event, the summit, has not been in the game in a very long time, so honestly, that was a cool change. And I am kind of curious how many people are even going to do this event, because I feel like people are not going to really want to do a long race. So I'm kind of interested to see how the overall leaderboards on this is going to stack up. For the most part, though, guys, I would say this summit is pretty dang entertaining. I know it's probably mainly Hypercar, which we've probably done hundreds of summits like that already, so it's probably not all that fascinating. But if you are trying to go after the 919 Club Sport, this is something you will have to do. And to be honest, if you're a collecting type of person like I am, you are most likely going to get this thing. Besides all of that, if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments below. Let's jump right into this one. And again, biggest thing, guys, just focus on the turning, making sure your nitrous is good and all that. Running a chemist set is great. And I would say a lot of people should do fairly decent on this summit if they do practice a bit. And I probably would say a lot of people, if you are newer, still going after this car, I think it's still possible to get this thing.